Today we're going to be talking about geologic time. And geologic time spans the time from the present all the way back to 4.6 billion years ago when the Earth was formed. Now if we look at this line right here, that's going to represent a timeline. And we're going to start the timeline with the formation of Earth. So Earth forms, and that was 4.6 billion years ago. 4,600,000,000 years ago. Now Earth formed through collections of dust in the solar system that existed from the Big Bang. And these collections of dust were actually pulled together by gravity. And that's why our planets and our stars are all round, because gravity pulls equally from all directions. And all that dust was pulled together to form Earth. Now, all that gravity pulling that dust together created a lot of pressure. And pressure creates heat. So Earth was a very hot place back when it first began. In fact, the Earth was so hot that there was no liquid water. All the liquid water was in the form of gas vapor. Only after tens and tens and tens of millions of years did the Earth cool down enough for that gaseous water to condense and rain back to Earth as rainwater and form our oceans, our lakes, and our rivers. And only then could life even begin to think about evolving, when you had liquid water and the molecules of life could actually get together. So Earth forms 4.6 billion years ago. At the other end of our timeline, we have the present, right now. And in between, everything happens. We're going to take this timeline and we're going to break it up into 4 parts called eras. And then we can actually take these eras and break them up into smaller chunks called periods. And we can go so on and so forth. I'm only going to really care about the eras, and maybe we'll even learn about 1 or 2 periods. But let's get started. The first era, and the longest era by far, was called the Precambrian Era. In fact, this era encompasses 90% of geologic time. 90% of geologic time. Now, obviously I did not draw that to scale, or that 90% would come way over here. But I need to leave room for the other 3 eras, and there's a lot of good things that happens in those other 3 eras. So I need to make room for that. So this is not going to be drawn to scale. All right, let's create the other 3 eras. There's 1, and there's 2 more. Right here, we have the Paleozoic Era. And then we have the Mesozoic Era. And finally, the era that we live in, called the Cenozoic Era. Now let's go ahead and we'll put some numbers here. These eras are separated at about 65 million years ago. And if we go back to here, about 245 million years ago. And then finally, around 540 million years ago. And again, these times are rough estimate. No scientist actually knows for certain exactly how many million years ago it was. So these are all rough estimates. And what actually separates the Precambrian Era from the Paleozoic Era, from the Mesozoic, from the Cenozoic? Some major event. And the same thing goes when we break these eras into periods. What actually separates those periods? Again, some type of major event that changes everything. Most of the time, those major events, unfortunately, were mass extinctions. This one right here was not a mass extinction. This one was a little bit different. This one right here is actually referred to as the Cambrian explosion. And it is not a physical explosion. Rather, it is an explosion of life. An explosion in the mass diversity of life. If we look at the fossil record up to this point, we saw a few different types of fossils, few different types of fossils, few different types of fossils. And then once you get to about 400 or 540 million years ago, all of a sudden we have this huge increase in the different types of fossils in the fossil record. All right? So this was a huge increase in the diversity, the number of species of life on Earth. And this lasted. How long did this Cambrian explosion actually last? It wasn't a short period of time in our sense, in our perspective, but it lasted approximately 20 million years. All right, 20 million years, and this is where it occurred right here, and it's named after the Cambrian, the first period here in the Paleozoic era, the Cambrian period. And it lasted about 20 million years. Now think about that, 20 million years. That's a very short amount of time when you're talking about 4,600,000,000 years. In fact, that is a tiny, itsy-bitsy part of 1%. So in terms of geologic time, this was an explosion. But we had a large increase in the diversity of life. Now, I like to think of evolution, draw an analogy to the making of a large snowball that you would make for a snowman. When you first start to make a snowball, it's very small. And you put it down in the snow, and you begin to roll it, and it starts to get bigger, but it gets bigger very slow. And then all of a sudden, almost exponentially, it just increases in size. All right? The same thing here is happening with evolution. It seems like it takes forever to get a few species of different types of organisms. And then all of a sudden, and nobody's really certain why, but maybe it's enough genetic raw material around, enough DNA, enough different types of organisms that all of a sudden the different types of life present just explodes, and we have this big increase in the diversity of life. And ever since, evolution has been increasing, and we've had some setbacks, but overall the number of species has been expanding. Until about now, and we'll talk about that later. Now, the next big division between our eras here is about 245 million years ago. And we think that this was a mass extinction. Again, if you look at the fossil record, we saw lots and lots of different types of fossils, and then all of a sudden, we saw relatively few fossils. We're talking different types of fossils. And we think that probably between 60 and 90 or 95% of all life was actually wiped out on Earth. And nobody quite knows sure why, but some people think it was due to massive climate change, in which organisms just couldn't adapt fast enough and they went extinct. This next one here, 65 million years ago, is actually better understood. Another mass extinction. This one is referred to as the KT event. KT stands for Cretaceous Tertiary. These were periods back in the Mesozoic era and the beginning of the Cenozoic era. So we call it the KT event. What actually is the KT event? We think that a comet struck Earth. A comet or an asteroid, whatever you want to call it. This large chunk of rock or ice struck Earth, probably several miles in diameter, going tens of thousands of miles an hour. You can imagine the mess it made when it struck Earth. In fact, all the organisms in the immediate area, and I'm talking hundreds to probably thousands of miles within that impact area, were just killed immediately. And then the amount of dust that was kicked up into our atmosphere probably took hundreds of thousands of years to begin to settle out. So as all that dust went up into the atmosphere, the weather changed. The temperature probably dropped. It probably became colder. And plants, in fact any photosynthetic organism, depends on sunlight. And as the amount of sunlight decreases, so does the amount of photosynthesis, and so does the amount of productivity, meaning the size and number of plants. So there goes the food chain, the basis of the food chain. And who's going to suffer the most? But the largest creatures, the creatures at the very top of the food chain. And those creatures were mainly, at this point, dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs actually go extinct. So the dinos go extinct. And again, this didn't happen immediately. This probably took hundreds of thousands to maybe even 1 million years for all the dinosaurs to disappear. Now, this was both good and bad, all right? The extinction of any species is probably not a good thing. However, it makes way for new species. And there was another mammal on the block at this time. There was another mammal that actually existed with the dinosaurs towards the end here. And these were small mouse-like mammals. Small mouse-like mammals. Mammals had recently evolved. They were small, they were mouse-like, but they had trouble diversifying and increasing in numbers. And most likely that was due to competitions with the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs preyed on them. The dinosaurs competed with them for space, living space, to build nests. The dinosaurs competed with those mammals for food. And because of those pressures, the mammals just could not evolve as they would have liked to. However, after the extinction of the dinosaurs, remember the small mouse-like mammals, they probably lived underground, obviously much smaller appetites than the dinosaurs, so they were able to weather the storm a little bit better. But when the dinosaurs disappeared, suddenly those small mammals weren't getting eaten anymore. They didn't have to compete for space as fiercely as they had before. They didn't have to compete for food as fiercely as they did before. And they had an opportunity to increase in number and begin to diversify. And the mammals were off to the races in a sense. In fact, the mammals began to do so well over the next tens of millions of years that we actually call the Cenozoic era the Age of Mammals. And because the dinosaurs did so well back in the Mesozoic era, in fact, they were around for about 150 to maybe 200 million years. One of the most successful animals ever on planet Earth. We refer to the Mesozoic era as the Age of Reptiles. And dinosaurs were reptiles. They had dry, scaly skin. They had claws. All characteristics of reptiles. So we're going to call the Mesozoic era the Age of Reptiles in honor of the dinosaurs at that time. Now, let's go back to the beginning, the Precambrian era. Earth forms 4.6 billion years ago. What was one of the first major things that happened? Life evolves. So life evolves. And life evolved about 3.5 billion years ago. Now think about that. That's 1 billion years since the Earth was formed. And again, it probably took that long for the Earth to cool down sufficiently, for enough water to form, and for conditions to be good enough for the molecules of life to actually get together and form that first cell. But if you look at the fossil record, you can actually see primitive bacteria around 3.5 to maybe 3.8 billion years ago. Now the next major milestone was at about 3 billion years ago. And this was cyanobacteria. A very successful group of bacteria. Cyano actually refers to the fact cyanin is a blue-green pigment. So oftentimes cyanobacteria are referred to as blue-green algae, even more, although more properly they're referred to as bacteria. Now, because they contain this blue-green pigment, they were actually photosynthetic. They could undergo photosynthesis. And one of the products of photosynthesis, besides glucose, is oxygen, free oxygen, O2. And oxygen, believe it or not, is a very damaging gas. In fact, oxygen is probably one of the main reasons for cancers on Earth nowadays. It's a free radical, it's highly reactive, and it goes in and it actually reacts with DNA and causes mutations. Bad stuff. And no organisms at the time had ever seen free oxygen before in the atmosphere. So they weren't prepared to deal with this free radical. So a lot of organisms ended up going extinct. In fact, it is thought that cyanobacteria might have caused one of the first mass extinctions on planet Earth. So it caused a lot of chaos back then. But some of the organisms, over time, adapted the ability to make enzymes to deal with this oxygen and help prevent some of the very bad effects of oxygen. And even later, some organisms developed the ability to actually utilize oxygen and make more energy than they could have without it. This is called cellular respiration. And a lot of organisms depend on all that energy today. Aerobic respiration. Now let's take a look at the next major event. And this was probably around 2 billion years ago. Okay. And this major event was the development of eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells develop. Now this was a huge evolutionary step forward, since eukaryotic cells are much more complex than their predecessors, the prokaryotic cells. So all of a sudden life became much more complex. Now after that, about 1.5 billion years ago, we have the development, I'm going to write it up here, of multicellularity. And multicellularity, that is a big deal. Now just think about that. 1.5 billion years ago, so you're looking at 3 billion, let's see, 4.6 minus 1.5, you're looking at about 3 billion years passed before the first organism that has 2 or more cells evolves. Long time. So evolution, again, was progressing relatively slowly. We did have some major steps, but it was moving relatively slowly up into that point. And then about 540 million years ago, big things start to happen, and we have this explosion in the diversity of life. Now, let's slide into the Paleozoic era. And the Paleozoic era is very special and near and dear to our hearts today for many reasons, but let's talk about one of the biggest reasons. Back then, there were huge fern forests that existed during the Paleozoic era. There were no gymnosperms or angiosperms, our modern day trees, but there were large fern forests. These fern trees were probably 40, 60 or more feet high, and they covered a lot of the planet. Now, if you know anything about ferns, they like moist areas. They like moisture. You're not going to see a fern growing out in the middle of a desert or the middle of a field. They like moist, damp areas. And we think that a lot of the earth was covered with shallow swamps. It was very moist. And when these trees lived, they died, they lived, they died, they lived, they died. When they died, they fell into a lot of these shallow swamps and were buried under water and silt, under anaerobic conditions. And they slowly decayed. And as they were buried, they were subjected to a lot of heat and pressure. And over millions of years, these huge fern forests, these dead, buried, huge fern forests, were transformed into fossil fuels. And fossil fuels have played a huge role in the development of our modern society. Now, what are the fossil fuels? Well, the fossil fuels are mainly 3. Coal, oil, and natural gas. And by the way, natural gas is CH4. It's methane. It's not the gasoline that's in your gas tanks. That's actually produced from oil. So natural gas. Now these huge fern forests made mostly coal. The oil was produced from plankton in the ocean, and the natural gas was produced in part from the fern forest and in part from the plankton in the ocean and in part due to other conditions. But the big guy here is coal. And coal is causing all kinds of problems today. And we'll talk about those in just a little bit. Now if we move on to let's move on to right about here. About 250 million years ago. Here we are. And let's write that, 250 million years ago. What happened? Pangaea. Pangaea, the supercontinent, the giant landmass, actually begins to break apart. And it is still breaking apart and expanding today. Now, why is this so important? Well, we know that the mechanisms that created Pangaea still exist today. So continents, tectonic plates, large puzzle-like pieces on the surface of the Earth, they actually float on molten lava. They're still moving around at about 1/4 of an inch to maybe 1/2 an inch a year. We can see this using our GPS satellites. In fact, if we look at North America and we look at Africa, they used to be one big continent. They broke apart and they've been moving apart ever since. They're moving apart at about 1/2 an inch a year. And if we look at the fossils and if we look at the rocks on the eastern portion of the United States and the western portion of Africa, they actually match up pretty well. Okay? A couple other lines of evidence to support the fact that there was a supercontinent at one point in time. And these continents, they're actually moving around. Some are getting closer together, some are getting further apart, and this is due to giant convection currents within the interior of the Earth created by radioactive decay, which produces heat. Another good line of evidence to support this is Antarctica, one of the coldest places on Earth, down at the South Pole. Well, if you actually dig down through 1 mile or 2 of ice, you will actually find remnants of a pine forest, an ancient pine forest. So that is another good indication that Antarctica used to be much closer to the equator than it is today. So Pangaea actually begins to break up. And this formation of continents and the breakup of continents, we think, because the mechanisms are still in place, occurred over and over throughout geologic time. Now, let's take a look at the Cenozoic era. About 200,000 years ago, modern humans evolved. And what do I mean by modern humans? That means if you took them, you cleaned them up, you educated them, they'd probably look and behave similar to you. And they evolved about 200,000 years ago. And it is thought that human-like organisms, humanoids, have been around for about 2 to 3 million years. They were a little bit different, a little bit hairier, a little bit shorter. Maybe the brain capacity wasn't quite what it is today. And many of those lineages had become extinct. And then modern humans around 200,000 years ago. And then about 50,000 years ago, modern humans actually migrated out of Africa. Probably due to the end of an ice age. Now again, 50,000 years ago, some scientists think that, some scientists think it might have been a little bit more, maybe even 100,000 years ago. Nobody's quite sure. But 50,000 years ago, we began to move out of Africa as those giant glaciers began to recede, and we moved up and out of Africa and eventually went on to populate the entire Earth. Lastly, so there were 5 major extinctions. We only talked about 1, 2 of those major extinctions, but there have been 5 major extinctions throughout geologic time and many smaller ones. But what's important here is right now, present. Many scientists, in fact most scientists, think we are undergoing the 6th mass extinction, Because if you look at what's happened in the last 300 years, with us burning fossil fuels, with the climate changing, with so much ongoing development, we've paved over many areas, we have developed many areas into cities, agriculture, we've cut down large swaths of forest to plant our own crops. If you look at all that, invasive species, you take all that into consideration, scientists estimate that organisms, species, are going extinct nowadays 10,000 times faster than before in recent history. 10,000 times faster. So that is definitely a matter to be concerned with. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot more debate in the future about that. But hopefully we can do something about that, or at least slow it down or stop it. And that is going to be it for Geologic Time.